Friends, thank you for being here today. We are living in extraordinary times, moments when the veil is lifted and we begin to see the real mechanics of power in this country. And let me tell you, Mr. Trump is in far deeper trouble than even I anticipated. Now, before you dismiss that as another political jab, I want us to step back and analyze this the way an economist, not a partisan, would, because what we are witnessing is not just the unraveling of one man's political fortunes, it is the symptom of a much bigger crisis in the American system itself. Donald Trump's troubles are not merely legal, though they are serious, they are structural. He represents, in many ways, the frustration and anger of tens of millions of Americans who feel betrayed by an economic system that promised prosperity but delivered insecurity, debt, and declining standards of living. The working class, white, black, Latino, has been squeezed for decades while a small minority grows obscenely rich. Trump skillfully positioned himself as the voice of that anger. Here's the catch: he has always been a creature of the very system his supporters despise. His wealth, his fame, his business dealings, all are rooted in the corporate capitalist structure that has eroded the lives of working people. And that contradiction, my friends, is catching up to him. What is deepening Trump's trouble is not simply that prosecutors and judges are circling, it is that the cracks in his narrative are widening. The billionaire populist routine can only be sustained so long as people believe he stands outside the establishment. But each new indictment, each revelation of shady financial dealings, each desperate attempt to dodge accountability exposes him as what he has always been, not an outsider, but an insider who played the system until the system turned on him. And when the illusion breaks, when his supporters begin to see that he is as entangled in corruption as those he denounces, then the political earthquake begins. But let me add this. We cannot afford to think this is just about Trump. His trouble is not only personal, it is systemic. The anger that fueled his rise will not disappear with his downfall. If anything, it may intensify, because the conditions, stagnant wages, crushing debt, unaffordable housing, rising healthcare costs, are still here. If the left does not step up to channel that anger into a genuine movement for economic democracy, then others like Trump, perhaps more polished, perhaps more dangerous, will rise again. His troubles, therefore, are a warning to us, a warning that unless we confront the root problem, capitalism itself, we will keep producing Trumps over and over again. Donald Trump's troubles are far deeper than a series of courtroom dramas or legal entanglements splashed across the headlines. What we are seeing unfold is not simply the story of an ex-president facing judges, prosecutors, and indictments. It is the exposure of a man who has always claimed to be above the system, outside the establishment, and somehow different from the political class. For years, Trump cultivated a powerful narrative: the billionaire outsider who could not be bought, the straight-talking businessman who would cut through Washington corruption and stand for the forgotten man. That story, repeated at rallies, amplified across social media, and embraced by tens of millions, became his greatest weapon. It separated him from the traditional politicians who had disappointed so many working-class Americans. But as his legal woes pile up, as new evidence surfaces, as the courts strip away his defenses, the very foundation of that narrative is collapsing. And in that collapse lies a political danger far greater than the charges themselves. Trump's legal troubles, ranging from allegations of fraud to election interference, highlight not only questionable behavior, but also a deeper contradiction in his image. A man who presented himself as the fearless outsider is being unmasked as someone deeply enmeshed in the very system he condemned. The revelations of business practices built on bending rules, exploiting loopholes, and navigating the world of corporate privilege do not reinforce his claim of independence from the establishment. They expose him as another product of it. What makes his situation especially precarious is that his supporters rallied around him precisely because they believed he was not part of that club. They believed he stood against the swamp. Now, every indictment, every courtroom appearance, and every detailed allegation of misconduct chips away at the illusion of independence. It transforms the image of Trump the populist into Trump the insider. And for a figure whose power rests on symbolism, that transformation is politically devastating. The deeper trouble here lies in the erosion of trust among his base. For years, Trump has been able to brush off scandal after scandal because his supporters viewed him as targeted by a corrupt elite desperate to silence him. That framing worked as long as the perception held that he was fundamentally different from those elites. But as his business records, tax dealings, and political maneuvers are laid bare, the line between Trump and the establishment blurs. He begins to look less like a victim of the system and more like a participant in it. And once that perception sets in, once supporters begin to feel that the man they trusted is not who he claimed to be, the very core of his political identity begins to fracture. This is why Trump's troubles are not just about legal consequences, but about political legitimacy. Leaders in history who built their strength on narratives of defiance and independence often found themselves undone when those narratives collapsed. The moment the public realizes the outsider is, in fact, an insider, the spell is broken. Trump's wealth, once a symbol of success that insulated him from corruption, now looks increasingly like evidence of the same backroom dealings and privileges enjoyed by the very elites he denounces. His legal entanglements reinforce this picture, transforming him into a mirror of the establishment he promised to destroy. The media spectacle of these trials and indictments compounds the problem. Trump thrives on attention, but not all attention is equal. A rally filled with chants and adoration builds his image. A courtroom filled with prosecutors and evidence corrodes it. The more the public sees Trump defending himself, not in the arena of ideas, but in the confines of the law, the more he looks vulnerable, compromised, and ordinary. The myth of invincibility, so central to his appeal, is steadily unraveling. A populist who cannot maintain the image of strength risks not only losing support, but also fueling disillusionment among those who once believed in him most fiercely. Trump's deeper trouble, then, is that the shield of outsider credibility is breaking apart. His legal issues alone may not end his political career. He has survived scandal before. But the broader consequence is that the public narrative surrounding him is shifting in ways he cannot easily control. When voters stop seeing him as a unique alternative and start recognizing him as just another politician entangled in corruption, his power diminishes. And in the world of politics, perception is everything. Donald Trump's current predicament cannot be reduced to a sequence of personal scandals or courtroom battles. The deeper reality is that his struggles reflect structural cracks in the American political and economic system, cracks that have been widening for decades. If we confine the analysis to Trump as an individual, his character, his actions, his missteps, we risk missing the far larger and more consequential story. Trump is not an aberration who suddenly appeared on the stage of history. He is a product of a system that has been corroding under the weight of inequality, dysfunction, and disillusionment. His rise and his potential fall both expose the systemic failures that define American life in the early 21st century. For years, Americans have been told that the economic system is strong, resilient, and uniquely capable of generating prosperity. Yet, for tens of millions, the lived reality tells a very different story. Wages stagnated while productivity rose, meaning workers contributed more value but received little in return. Job security eroded, pensions vanished, and healthcare became more expensive even as it grew harder to access. Housing prices soared beyond the reach of ordinary families, while student debt trapped younger generations in cycles of repayment and despair. In such a climate, anger and resentment inevitably build. People feel betrayed by a system that seems designed to enrich a few while leaving the majority to struggle. That betrayal created fertile ground for Trump's message, and it is also why his current legal troubles carry meaning far beyond his personal fate. When an economy repeatedly fails to deliver on its promises, political legitimacy begins to collapse. Trump's election in 2016 was already a sign of this collapse. He capitalized on the structural failures of American capitalism by presenting himself as the antidote to a system that no longer worked. But the irony is that his own career, his business practices, and his political maneuvers were inseparable from that very system. Now, as his legal entanglements reveal layer after layer of questionable dealings, the broader failure of the system is mirrored in his personal collapse. It is not just a matter of one man facing justice. It is the exposure of a ruling elite that bends rules, manipulates laws, and shields itself from accountability until the contradictions become too great to contain. The structural dimension of Trump's troubles is also evident in how deeply polarized and fragmented the United States has become. A functioning political and economic system is expected to mediate conflicts, balance interests, and provide a sense of stability. But what we see instead is escalating polarization, with Trump both a symptom and a driver of that division. His supporters view him as a champion of their discontent, while his opponents see him as the embodiment of corruption and authoritarianism. This polarization is not created out of thin air. It emerges from decades of declining faith in institutions, growing inequality, and the inability of the system to address basic needs. Trump's troubles are therefore inseparable from the larger crisis of governance and legitimacy facing the United States. The legal process itself also underscores the systemic dimensions of the crisis. The spectacle of a former president facing multiple indictments would once have been unthinkable, yet it now feels like the logical extension of a system unraveling under its own contradictions. At the same time, the way the process is interpreted, by some as accountability, by others as persecution, reveals a public that no longer shares a common understanding of law, justice, or truth. When trust in institutions erodes to this degree, the legal troubles of a political figure like Trump become not just personal struggles, but collective flashpoints. They expose how fragile the foundations of the system have become and how easily they could fracture further. Even the media's role in amplifying Trump's story reflects structural weakness. A system of information once expected to inform and hold power accountable has, in many cases, become driven by profit, clicks, and spectacle. Trump thrived in this environment, and his troubles continue to dominate because they feed the same dynamics. The system, in other words, cannot help but consume itself. It elevates Trump, thrives on the controversies surrounding him and in the process reveals its own dysfunction to the public. What makes Trump's troubles so significant is not whether he wins or loses a case, nor whether he reclaims or fails to reclaim political power. The larger issue is that his rise and fall expose the fragility of an economic and political system that has long ceased to deliver on its promises. His legal entanglements and public battles act as a mirror reflecting the corruption, inequality, and instability embedded within American life. And whether Trump ultimately triumphs or collapses, those structural issues will remain, continuing to destabilize the system until they are directly confronted. The illusion of Donald Trump as a genuine outsider, a populist standing against the entrenched establishment, is unraveling more rapidly with each passing development in his legal and political saga. For years, Trump's most potent weapon has been the carefully crafted image that he is different, untouched by the corruption of Washington, untainted by the deals and compromises of professional politicians, and uniquely positioned to fight for those who felt abandoned by the system. This illusion was powerful because it spoke directly to the anger of working-class Americans who watched decade after decade of promises dissolve into economic decline, outsourcing, rising costs, and political gridlock. Trump did not need to prove he was one of them. He only needed to convince them that he was against the same elites they despised. That image carried him to the White House. But illusions, no matter how strong, eventually collide with reality, and the reality now breaking through is one that places Trump firmly within the very establishment he claimed to oppose. The unraveling began quietly with reports of his business dealings and connections to powerful corporate interests, but it has accelerated with the mounting legal challenges that reveal in painstaking detail how his wealth and influence were built. The populist narrative begins to collapse when supporters realize that Trump, like the elites he condemns, has long relied on exploiting loopholes, bending rules, and securing personal advantage at the expense of others. The outsider pose cannot survive when evidence mounts that he used the insider's playbook all along. The man who rallied crowds against the swamp is increasingly revealed as a creature of it, sustained by the same networks of privilege and power he pretended to oppose. This shift in perception is particularly dangerous for Trump because his political brand is inseparable from his image. Unlike traditional politicians who can lean on party infrastructure or long-standing institutional legitimacy, Trump's appeal rests almost entirely on the idea that he is unique, an exception to the rules of politics. When that uniqueness is stripped away, when he begins to look ordinary, just another wealthy figure entangled in corruption, the core of his appeal erodes. Supporters who once excused his behavior on the grounds that he was under attack by the establishment may find it harder to maintain that defense, as the evidence shows him enmeshed within the very fabric of that establishment. The media coverage of Trump's ongoing crises reinforces this erosion of the outsider illusion. Courtroom sketches, legal documents, and prosecutorial statements portray a man grappling with the same vulnerabilities as any other defendant. The more Trump is seen defending himself within the machinery of the system, the less convincing his image as an invincible rebel becomes. Populism depends on strength, on the projection of power and resilience in the face of opposition. But the optics of being bogged down in trials, hearings, and legal maneuvering paint the opposite picture a leader weakened, compromised, and ordinary. That shift in optics is as damaging as any verdict. The illusion's collapse also exposes a broader truth about the populist strategy itself. Trump was not the first and will not be the last politician to adopt the language of anti elitism while relying on elite structures to sustain power. The difference is that Trump leaned on this strategy more heavily and more visibly than most. His defiance of political norms, his constant invocation of the forgotten American, and his aggressive rhetoric against establishment figures created the perception that he truly stood apart. Yet populism without substance eventually falters. When rhetoric is not backed by consistent action, when promises to drain the swamp are contradicted by backroom deals, the mask slips, and when it does, disillusionment sets in. What makes this disillusionment especially profound is that it affects not only Trump, but the entire political landscape. For many of his supporters, Trump was the last great hope that the system could be challenged from within. If he is revealed as no different from the elites he denounced, the resulting anger may turn not just against him, but against the system itself. That anger could fracture into apathy, withdrawal, or the search for an even more radical figure who can sustain the illusion longer. Either way, the collapse of Trump's outsider persona is not simply the fall of a politician. It is a turning point in the ongoing crisis of legitimacy facing American politics. The illusion that sustained Trump for so long was never built on policy achievements or institutional credibility. It was built on the perception that he was fundamentally different. As that perception erodes under the weight of evidence, legal scrutiny, and public exposure, Trump faces a deeper trouble than any legal ruling could deliver. The loss of the outsider image strips him of the very identity that made him powerful, leaving behind only another figure of the establishment he once denounced. The anger that fueled Donald Trump's rise is not disappearing simply because his legal problems are multiplying or because his image as an outsider is crumbling. That anger was never about Trump as an individual. It was about the conditions of life in the United States for millions of working people who felt abandoned, deceived, and stripped of dignity. Trump became the vessel for that anger, not its source. His skill lay in channeling it, amplifying it, and presenting himself as its embodiment. But the underlying frustrations, stagnant wages, job insecurity, ballooning healthcare costs, the crushing weight of debt, and the daily struggle to afford housing and basic necessities remain as raw as ever. These realities are not tied to the fortunes of one politician. They are the ongoing consequences of a system that has failed to deliver on its promises, and they will continue to shape American politics regardless of what happens to Trump. The anger of working Americans has deep roots in economic transformation. Over the last 40 years, the promises of prosperity through hard work have collided with the reality of declining economic mobility. The shift of industries overseas hollowed out communities, replacing stable jobs with precarious work in the service sector. Union power, once a counterweight to corporate dominance, declined dramatically, leaving workers with less bargaining power and fewer protections. Meanwhile, costs in key areas of life soared. Education became a pathway to opportunity only at the price of lifelong debt. Healthcare transformed into a source of financial anxiety. Housing markets inflated to levels that priced out entire generations. These conditions are not temporary problems, but structural features of modern American capitalism. They have produced a simmering resentment that politicians from both parties have largely failed to address. Trump tapped into this resentment by naming enemies, immigrants, foreign governments, political elites in the media, and by presenting himself as the warrior who would fight them on behalf of the forgotten American. His rhetoric resonated precisely because it matched the lived experiences of millions who felt ignored or dismissed by establishment politicians. But what has become increasingly clear is that Trump offered anger without solutions, blame without change. His years in office did little to alter the structural forces driving inequality and insecurity. Yet the anger persists because the underlying problems persist. The same families struggling in 2016 are still struggling in 2025, and many are worse off. This persistence of anger is what makes Trump's legal troubles both significant and insufficient. Even if he is ultimately discredited or politically weakened, the discontent he harnessed will not evaporate. In fact, it may intensify as supporters interpret his downfall as further evidence of a system rigged against them. The cycle of anger is self-reinforcing. People feel abandoned. They rally around a figure who channels that feeling. The figure is undermined or exposed, and the anger deepens because once again, they are left without meaningful change. This cycle creates fertile ground for new figures to emerge, perhaps more disciplined, more strategic, or more radical than Trump, who can capture the same resentment and redirect it. The political danger lies in the direction that anger will take. Left unaddressed, it can easily be channeled toward division, scapegoating, and authoritarian solutions. Trump demonstrated how effectively anger can be mobilized against immigrants, minorities, and dissenters. But the same anger could be redirected toward constructive ends if there were a political movement capable of articulating real solutions: higher wages, universal health care, affordable housing, and stronger protections for workers. Without such a movement, the energy of frustration remains available for demagogues who promise easy answers while avoiding the deeper structural issues. What must be understood is that this anger is rational, not irrational. It is the natural response of people whose expectations have been betrayed by an economic system that concentrates wealth and power at the top while leaving insecurity at the bottom. To dismiss this anger as ignorance or bigotry, as some commentators have done, is to miss its foundation. People are not wrong to feel that the system has failed them. The evidence is overwhelming. What is dangerous is when that anger is misdirected, manipulated, and weaponized by leaders who serve their own interests rather than the interests of the people they claim to champion. The persistence of this anger means that Trump's fall, should it come, will not mark the end of populist politics in America. On the contrary, it may mark the beginning of a new phase. His legal troubles may strip him of credibility, but they will not erase the conditions that made him possible. The discontent remains, searching for a new voice, a new leader, a new channel. That is why Trump's predicament must be seen not as a final act, but as part of an ongoing story. The underlying anger that lifted him to power is still alive, and it will continue shaping American politics long after his own fate is decided. The deeper trouble that surrounds Donald Trump points to an even larger reality. Without addressing the structural inequalities of capitalism itself, the United States will continue to generate figures like Trump, perhaps stronger, sharper, and even more dangerous. His political rise was not an accident or an isolated event. It was the outcome of decades of economic concentration at the top, declining living standards for the majority, and a steady erosion of trust in institutions. When vast numbers of people feel excluded from the benefits of the system, when they no longer believe that hard work will secure a better life, and when they see wealth and power locked in the hands of a small elite, they become ripe for the promises of a leader who declares war on the establishment. Trump's legal struggles may mark a turning point in his own story, but the underlying engine that produced him remains fully intact. The American economic system has, for generations, promised upward mobility in exchange for effort and discipline. But for most working families, that promise has collapsed. Wages adjusted for inflation have barely moved since the 1970s, while costs for housing, education, and healthcare have skyrocketed. Productivity has soared, yet the rewards of that increased output have flowed almost entirely to the top 1%. Corporations reaped record profits, stock markets boomed, and billionaires multiplied, but everyday Americans found themselves burdened with debt and financial insecurity. This imbalance is not a temporary glitch. It is the predictable outcome of an economic system designed to prioritize capital over labor. In such a context, it was only a matter of time before anger and resentment sought political expression. Trump was one vessel, but if the system remains unchanged, others will emerge to take his place. The risk is not only repetition, but escalation. Trump's version of populism was chaotic, often improvised, and riddled with contradictions. He paired anti-elitist rhetoric with pro-business policies, promising to fight for workers while cutting taxes for the wealthy. His contradictions eventually caught up to him, leaving him exposed. But future figures who learn from his mistakes may craft a more disciplined populism, one that blends cultural grievance with economic rhetoric in ways that are even harder to resist. Such leaders could exploit the same discontent while avoiding the pitfalls that weaken Trump. In this sense, his troubles are less a conclusion and more a warning of what the future may hold if the root causes are left unaddressed. The central root cause is capitalism's inability to reconcile private profit with broad social needs. An economy that prioritizes shareholder returns inevitably sacrifices worker security, public investment, and equitable growth. Political leaders tied to corporate donors and financial backers rarely challenge this imbalance. Instead, they manage it, offering modest reforms while leaving the structure intact. For ordinary citizens, the result is a sense of abandonment, a belief that no matter who occupies office, their lives remain precarious. It is within this vacuum that populist figures thrive. They promise radical breaks, dramatic gestures, and simple answers to complex problems. The cycle will repeat until the underlying structure of the economy is transformed. It is important to recognize that the anger driving populism could also be mobilized toward progressive change. The very frustrations that Trump tapped into, stagnant wages, declining communities, unaffordable necessities, are precisely the issues that a movement for economic democracy could address. Policies that expand worker ownership, strengthen unions, guarantee health care, and reduce the concentration of wealth could provide real solutions to the discontent festering across the country. But such measures challenge the core interests of the economic elite, and without organized pressure from below, they remain unlikely to be enacted. The absence of such a movement leaves the field open for demagogues who promise salvation while protecting the system that generates the crisis. Trump's downfall, therefore, should not be mistaken for the downfall of populism. If anything, it reveals the depth of the need for structural change. His inability to resolve the contradictions of his message demonstrates that cosmetic gestures and empty slogans are not enough. but his success in channeling anger shows how powerful the demand for change has become. As long as capitalism continues to produce inequality, insecurity, and disillusionment, leaders will rise to exploit it. The question is whether those leaders will use that energy to build a more just and democratic economy or to consolidate power through division and resentment. Trump's story, with all its drama, spectacle, and controversy, is inseparable from the system that produced him. His legal battles may weaken him personally, but the economic conditions that lifted him to prominence remain as sharp as ever. Without systemic change, the United States will continue to generate new versions of Trump, leaders who channel discontent while ultimately serving the very system they denounce. The danger is that the next one may be more careful, more polished, and more effective, making the challenge to democracy even greater than what we have seen so far. So, yes, Mr. Trump is in far deeper trouble than I anticipated. But the real trouble, the one we must not lose sight of, is the trouble facing working Americans in this broken economic system. Trump's personal downfall may satisfy some, but it will solve little. The question before us is simple. Will we allow this system to continue producing demagogues and disasters, or will we finally seize the moment to demand an economy that serves the many, not the few? That, my friends, is the challenge history has placed in our hands, and it is up to us whether we rise to meet it.